After years of struggling with what he thought to be the proper attempt to become continually aware of his own mental activity, to become conscious of consciousness and all that that implies, such as making it more stable and personal, and directing it to only matters of his own individual interest. Well, at any rate, after years of such involvement and effort, with infrequent, very brief moments of unquestionable success, but 99% of his life still being spent in the natural mental state, which, compared to the other, can best be called semi-catatonic. Yeah. Well, after years of this experienced reality, this man eventually began to wonder if the body itself is not more responsible for what men call consciousness than they've always imagined. How else to explain their ability as thinking conscious creatures to survive and prosper as they do while living in such a comparatively low, near non-existent state of active individual consciousness? A man once asked himself, does knowing what the problem is help if knowing is part of the problem? Better served he'd have been had he pondered it if knowing what the problem is a non-ending knowing, always unfolding, until you're down to the face-to-face reality of simply having to do what you know must be done. The first man to produce a running automobile discovered a totally unexpected reality about the vehicle. As soon as he had it all put together and ready to go, a radio, which he had not installed, began to play. And not only play, but play no matter what he did. He couldn't turn the thing off. Due to this fact, men have completely forgotten about this original inventor of the car and have assigned the accomplishment to others who followed and did not undergo such a realization. Conclusion, if you're still conscious, history does not record the exploits of those who actually discover something. Hey, history asks, you expect books to engage in book burning? Yeah, says the rest of civilization. That goes for us too. And we should have known it. Thoughts jumped on the bandwagon also. There was once an order of warriors whose core of training was based on learning how to shoot a bullet down the barrel of the rifle you're shooting from. The prince of a certain non-standard kingdom once sardonically noted that it is the common man who has given suicide such a shabby name. Undiagnosed urban laws of motion. In city carnivals, carousels will not run in one direction if they cannot run in the opposite. A certain myth tells of an ancient band of mystical seekers whose only expressed desire was, let us be free to leave this place, which many thought sounded much like a prayer, a conclusion with which the mystics could not take absolute exception, but did point out it differed from standard supplications in that, in their case, they realized there was no one to whom to direct their request. One man's thoughts used to talk to him until they began to realize how dumb he thought they were. The just said constitutes tonight's Gooby Dust fairy tale. Since ideas offensive to the public peace already run past you in one direction aren't later supposed to be presented as coming from the other. And a viewer thinks, so that's why all this makes such good sense. On a shadow world of this one, their ideas of the psychology of man arose somewhat differently. In that, in their instance, they first looked at how devious and unpredictable their consciousness was, and then turned outward, transferring this to life and dividing it up into a conscious life and a subconscious one. And no, I am not at liberty to say whether or not this proved of any benefit to them. You want to know? you go there. There is yet a still older version of that popular creation myth that says the reason for the split between man, as portrayed by Adam, and God, I guess as portrayed by God, was due to an act never reported, the act of Adam giving a name to God and spoiling the whole thing. And of course, as with all myths, some parts of this story may not be literally factual. But who knows? And now for some more reliable news from the world of science. Astronomers have recently discovered traces of an ancient solar system which appears to have met its end through a series of events wherein at least one of its planets attempted to jump down the throat of its sun. And anyone who hears this as being any more substantial than the previous story about Adam having given life a name has missed the point by several light years. In an attempt to overcome certain personal laws of gravity, one man would periodically pull a pop quiz on his inner systems by asking them, which came first, thoughts or my mind? Which ultimately seemed to prod life at times to peer out from behind the many names bestowed upon it. Once upon a time, there was a man who began to suspect that everything that existed was hidden behind something else. Not unlike the natural arrangement of the cart coming after the horse, the effect coming after the cause, and man's thoughts believing that they come after something or other. After the man had paid the enlightened one an exceedingly large sum of cash, he, in return, was told this: about the only difference between mystics and everyone else is that mystics won't stop where everyone else does. And in a surprising attempt to get the absolute most for his money, the man acted as though the awakened one's answer was something less than the final word, and that he intended it to be taken thusly. Every night, just as he was going to sleep, one man would think to himself, if I could but become my own teacher, or at least get alert enough to say, realize that I am, and must be, my own teacher. This sort of thing always made his electric blanket extremely uncomfortable. When it comes to the laws of decency, thoughts in the mind have never even heard of the principles of corrosion. And that's the coda to that tune. One of the 10 principles in effect in one mystical order was this: you can talk to ordinary people all you want to. Now, I forget which number this is. A certain man who had long applied himself to an interest in the matter of being individually conscious finally had to ask himself, how many more times can I think about what I know is so in this regard, while unable to do it consistently without exploding into a billion pieces or else dissolving into a mushy puddle? In subsequent moments, he also rhetorically wondered how many trillions or dozens of men had previously asked themselves that same abominably offensive question. Yeah. In one of his future lives, one mystic attempted to come back as a set of stairs, but one which only allowed access in one direction. According to legend, there was once a race of men who had no idea of evil, only the suspicion of there being a gigantic period which roamed the earth, seeking what sentences it might bring to an end. Although the realities of civilization, man's institutions, cultures, moral codes, laws, and models of progress appear to be external to him, they are in fact as movies shown on a screen, and his mind the projector being operated by life. The danger in realizing this, if there be such, lies somewhere between all the flicks becoming boring and your popcorn being stale. No illusion can survive without a constant, consistent input of additional illusions. And nothing better exemplifies this fact than the life of man's thoughts. Thus, to dismiss the mental world of man as imaginary and meaningless is to miss the reality of it entirely. It's just a matter of it being the one creature who can subsist on food that to the body seems irrelevant to survival. And once more might I note, a reason not to criticize anything which you do not fully comprehend. According to one myth, life was once a cattle herd and men cowpunchers. Then men became the herd and life took over the drive. Then it went back to life being the herd and men the cowpokes, and back again to the reverse. Does anyone sense a pattern emerging here? Does anyone begin to suspect the mind is the mother of all patterns and is the bastard love child of life itself? Since maritime news travels slower over water, we'll repeat a story we reported on last week. Often when it appears that a ship may be in danger, the captain will announce, "It appears that we may be in danger." An assurance that is supposed to have a greater impact on the passengers than it did on you who heard it the first time, which of course can turn out to be one and the same. And while we're here at it, we might as well acknowledge that we receive many, many letters from viewers requesting that we not repeat any item we've already covered. But wait! Are those actually letters from viewers? Or could they perchance be your own old-time thoughts reacting to the possible appearance of young upstarts? Yeah. Who but a fearless, resourceful, and insightful captain would proclaim as proper response to apparent danger the appearance of danger? That's all. Just announce that it's present. This doesn't strike anyone as sounding suspiciously like a description of man's thoughts. There was once a universe in which existed living, thinking myths who told men. Recent statistics show that less than 1.8% of the humans who hear this story will understand what it implies, and that less than 0.5% of those will be pleased that they did so. Yeah. But truth in numbers time. The above is slightly misleading inasmuch as there is no such thing as slightly misleading, which itself is somewhat disingenuous inasmuch as there is no such universal phenomenon as misleading. This coming only about as slag from men's attempt to mine gold through the mythologizing of that which they do not understand, which is to say the plain cold truth about life. Sure signs that a prospector's been at it too long. For one thing, his back's all bent and his knees are probably shot. He likely has no immediate family and is probably in debt. And it's also predictable that his hands will be frozen in the position of holding a mining pan long after he's forgotten having ever been in search of treasure. A man once wrote to the columnist, "Dear Mystic," and asked the question, "Dear Mystic, does what you say sometimes make me feel discouraged because of what you said, or is it because of something in me's interpretation of what you said?" Yeah. "What'd you say?" replied the mystic. And the gentleman thought it a shame that the paper did not have a section devoted to public expressions of deep-felt sarcasm and well-founded aggression. In regard to certain non-routine matters, a speaker so addressed some listeners: "Not only does man consistently live in a state of mental awareness that is less focused, controlled, personal, and revealing than is possible at every given moment, not only does he do so, but even made conscious of an alternative one, he still almost invariably falls back into the original mechanical state. Doesn't that tell you people, you foolish people still involved with such a struggle, something? And indeed, to many in the audience, it was that alarming reminder once again. After his overthrow, the deposed king was given his choice of executions, to either be shot in his thoughts or in his behavior. And that earlier noted prince again notes, what a shame it is that ordinary minds have dragged the idea of suicide to such low realms that in fact now they show no signs of having even ever looked down the barrel of their own heady rifle. Cutlery and consciousness. It was life who handed man his mind and pronounced it a two-edged sword. And Eve, portraying the garden part of a mystic, who first said to life, hey, don't stick that thing in me. But alas, 'tis hard to get life to keep anything to itself. That's why life is life, and you're out there pulling up weeds. Okay, said the king, give it to me one more time. I can either be shot in my thoughts or in my behavior. Is that right? Is that it? As reward for the lad having gone 2 straight weeks without throwing his paper in the bushes or up on the roof, a certain genie offered him his choice of 2 boons, after explaining to the bonehead what boons were. Anyway, a choice between either having cancer on the outside of his body or on the inside. And the boy stood there, chewing his lip, cutting his eyes for a bit, then finally offered this response. I'm assuming in my head that you're actually referring to things that go on in my head. And the genie was so impressed with the lad's perception that he made a mental note to himself to someday maybe pay him what he owed him for the papers. Those who are concerned over protecting man's mental operations display a total ignorance of what thoughts are about and made of. In response to a man's question, a mystic replied, yes, it is hard if one is only partially committed to the quest. But beyond what you ask, I'll answer even further and tell you that I cannot say that makes it more difficult, that is more difficult than if one is truly, totally committed. Mm-hmm. And upon hearing this, the man instantly approached the intermolecular speed that physicists technically refer to as, I almost wish I hadn't asked. Yeah. If behavior was of any consequence to ordinary men, then they would be better by now than ordinary, since they have behaved in every way possible. There was once a world which had no myths or metaphors. It soon perished. There was once a world which went beyond myths and metaphors, and it flourished. The only worlds worthy of man's note are his own mental ones. A boy inquired of the one passing for his father, is it safe to assume that a man knows nothing if, in his speech, he specifically names another and holds him up to contempt? And the bigger of the two replied, not only that, but if he names anyone specifically and holds them up to anything. Once they got the tax code down good in the city, it went like this. The weaker you are, the dumber you are. And the more serious you are, the more fearful you are. And the more opinionated you are, the more stressed out you are. And the more you believe that you do your own thinking, the more you will freely send in to the tax office. Up on the edge of a cliff, a little boy stood peeing down into the sea. And his father approached him and told him he should not do such a thing. And as the lad turned to ask why, he peed on his father's foot. And the elder said, well, that for one reason. Life puts into life, and life takes out of life. That which the mind tends to take as life. Only the body, the shadow, and the awakened know what thoughts lurk in the thoughts of men. And even they are not immune to pissing on your foot now and then. Amidst the passionate struggle to achieve that special consciousness, one man told life point blank, "You're wasting your time trying to frighten me out of this." And upon hearing the word frighten, life fell to the floor in a helpless mass of laughter, which allowed just enough time for the man to make his escape, except for the fact of there being nowhere to go outside of life. "Ah," he said, "I knew that." Another semi-deceased giveaway. Not only do foolish people ask serious questions, they also expect serious replies. Thus does the eternal wheel of seriousness and foolishness continue to turn in man's minds. If for no other reason, those involved in the struggle to be more conscious distinguish themselves from everybody else by the fact that, from their view, they can be even less conscious than everyone else. Yeah, I know. It just seems so from their perspective. But, God Almighty, that's still lots worse than just bad enough. There was once a little boat that seemed to have sailed away, far away from all danger. But this little dinghy eventually took mental and verbal note of the situation, and bingo! Before you could say starboard, everything changed. And it was once again surrounded by danger. Solely because of it taking undue note of it having not been. God Almighty, cried the ship's doctor, it's always worse than just bad enough, if you know what you're doing. The sounds of life's vital activities strike the mind of man much like a dog barking in the night, with his most common inclination being to throw something in its direction. A mother banged on the closed door to a son's room, calling out, "Stop that noise, I can't stand it. What are you doing in there?" And he replied, "Just growing." Men tend to pick on their relatives for a lack of an apparent alternative. During times of warfare, as a show of patriotism and expression of their disdain for the enemy, the more alert will place at the bottom of their urinals photographs of the word apparently, and let the certainty splash where they may. One man's most recent suspicion: I'll bet that not only do the more conscious not like to hear their name said, but that they don't even like to say it. He felt comfortably secure that this was so, though didn't know why. Although it should be obvious to you by now, I'll enunciate it. I'll say it anyway. The way to keep from criticizing something is not to think about it. The payoff of criticism is what motivates horses to trample on worms so that, as they imagine it, they will look better in the eyes of nuclear physicists. In the mental city of man, that which goes up has no limit. It can go up and up and up as long as men think about it. As his understanding enlarged, one man mused that it was probably a very good thing that the body experiences no sense of jealousy in any area non-physical, or else it'd drive itself crazy worrying over what the mind can do. There was once a king who, in an attempt to subdue his possible enemies, before they had any chance of overcoming him, would starve them one and all. Oh, how he would starve them. He would starve them on Monday. He would starve them on Friday. Starve them in the wintertime, starve them in the summertime. Oh, how he starved them. But it didn't do a bit of good. He continued to grow and prosper in that measured, mechanical manner always appropriate to landlocked rulers. There was once a knightly order whose internal memo was, fly away, but never into heavens already plotted by man. Clouds in the sky, same as thoughts in the mind, same as zoning restrictions in the city, all serve to keep out the riffraff. It takes an out-of-state bird to be able to fly in an environment so symbolically alien to local laws of aerodynamics. There was once a planet on which the creatures believed that one time, long ago, life had provided life there with a transfusion, but one that went awry. One that turned out not to help them, but that helped destroy them. Some beings on other planets are dumb as hell, if you don't mind me saying so. Who said that, they ask. I don't guess it's even worth a rhetorical inquiry as to whether rereading of these tonight would be of any boon. A few more hits before I leave it at looking at government as an external example of the collective mind of man. Just pulling, or just two or three other so delicious, so vine ripened examples going on in the world that the head gardener could not resist, bringing us a small bushel, if not a peck. All right, two or three. Again, we're looking, or the people who criticize, we're looking at government as that sort of, it's an external to them, of course, activity, organization, undertaking that seems to range from some promise, oftentimes unexpected, unreliable minor successes, to widespread failures, foolishness, irresponsibility. There are claims, always been, but here we're in the midst of them again, claims that the government, this perceived external organization that has control over the people, the local citizens, that the government is less efficient in certain areas. Nowadays, the lukewarm topics seem to be health and child care, education. But there are certain areas in which ordinary men point an accusatory finger at government on the basis that it is less efficient in these certain areas than an individual might be. And I'm not going to bother to drag it all out there. If you have any intellectual vitality to your mind as it is, then you know the kinds of arguments that they use, and they do not seem to be, from a cursory view, ill-founded. It just seems that bureaucracies, committees, large organizations, no matter how well intended, in certain areas, they always say in certain areas, tend to be less efficient than an individual might be. That it is quite common to have critics sometimes in large numbers and in smaller numbers. It's just the same old peak and valley effect that runs through like an EKG through the civilized history of man. But it is, as they would point it out now, they would say, such critics, they would say that if you turn over the rearing of a child, just absolutely over to the government, over to some external organized body of men, that what the government will turn out, what will be the end product, even if it's fairly acceptable, it will be done in a much less efficient manner than an individual, in this case, usually they refer to the parents, than the parents could do. And often, such criticisms also point to the outcome, not just a matter of efficiency, but they point to the outcome as being inefficient, which is to say that the government, that is external, organized groups of people, cannot turn out as good a product, in this case a child, as they call it, productive member of society, that they cannot turn out one as productive, as well balanced as most parents can. Might I remind you, I think maybe I'll go ahead and just hit 2 or 3 examples before we back up. But I'll do it later anyway, to point out to you to take these examples that we're making no criticism. I'm just pointing out and also filling in some of the flesh as to the kind of basis, the kind of, as they would call it, rational, reasonable basis and explanations they could give for their criticism. I'll go ahead and do it for them. Think they'll appreciate it, by the way. Don't get me started on that stuff. They ever write to me? They ever even call and say, how are you? Could I send you something? No. I was going to say to take these examples and apply them to the relationship between an individual man and his thoughts, as opposed to an individual man and his relationship to the government or any external institution, but to the government. No, wait a minute, I can't resist. I'll stay on this for a second. Assuming that we could find examples, but I assume that you see it, that a reasonable citizen, a reasonable person can serve up a reasonable, factually based examples of governments trying to undertake child care, the education, the rearing, the socialization, the education of a child, for it to take primary responsibility rather than the individual parents, and they turn out not a good citizen but a monster. So let's assume on that basis that the person we're talking to, or let's just assume that there are reasonable based examples of such occurring. But now turn that to, as I was encouraging, that we're not, instead of that example of a relationship between a man, an individual man's relationship to the government, look upon it on the basis intellectually, neurally, of an individual man's reliance on the collective thinking of man. My inference being, my tacit inference, which is about to be untestified, is that if we can find examples, which we can, wherein the government, in its collective wisdom, with all of its additional resources that the individual may not have, still, in cases we can find, and not finite numbers of cases, it has attempted, for instance, to undertake the socialization, education, and rearing of a child, and did it less efficiently, had a less admirable outcome than would an individual parent. Instead of all that, look at man, an ordinary man's absolute reliance. Instead of the government now, think about his absolute intellectual reliance on the collective mental world of man, of man's collective mind, which I already started out saying that that's all the government in one sense represents, as an external projection of it. But men look to their minds and they never criticize it. When I say look to their minds, remember I'm speaking of the collective mind of man. It is as real, even though ordinary people might think that I made up the term or that it's meant metaphorically, the collective mind of man. And they can say, well, there is no really such thing. Well, they can say that, but if there is no such thing, then there is no such thing as government, because the collective mind of man is just as real, literally, is just as real as government. Any government is just as real as any religion, just as real. But men are not accustomed to thinking in that manner by any means, because they could respond and say, well, that is not true, especially since you put in literally. It is not true because I can point to a government. And you cannot point to the collective mind of man. They could challenge me. They could say, I can at least point to aspects. I can point to material, physical entities of the government. I can show you arms, functions of the government in operation. The government, whether we approve of it or not, they could say, the government exists. Here's manifestations. Here's its footprints. Here's its fingerprints. Here's its doings. Then they could say to me, show me anything comparable in what you're calling the collective mind of man, which you are absolutely comparing to the government. Ha-ha, you can't do it. Well, of course I can, or I wouldn't have challenged myself, would I? Well, if I was an idiot, I might have. Oh my God, I've finally done it. I did the challenge, and I was just suddenly trying to think a couple of noony seconds ahead, and I can't respond to it. You clever devil. You know why you can't see any examples of the collective mind of man? Because everything we're talking about is part of it. Them saying, well, I can see aspects of the government, but I challenge you. Show me the slightest evidence that there is such a thing as the collective mind of man. Of course, if I was feeble and idiotic enough to respond, I would point at what the person just said. You know, but we've been through this and go, and they go, what? You go, that. They go, what's that? And I mean, there's only so long that you want to dance with a club-footed fat person. Yeah. Which is any time at all. People rely, the mind of individual men rely absolutely on the collective mind of man the same way that a true aficionado of government, one, let us say for one example, a born into welfare, supporter of welfare, someone who is an absolute, in the broad sense of the word, is what fascists used to really be. People who are absolutely just addicted to the idea of government. Just the whole idea that government is just it. That we could not survive without government, which there's some validity to that. But their idea of not just the theory of government, not just the social collectivization of men getting together and trying to live at some level, ascending the mere survival level, which is civilization, and after that, always, as even the caveman decided, well, look, we got now 12 or 15 of us living here in these caves on this one mountain, and we can't keep getting together and deciding what to do and how much water to drink out at one time before the rains come back. Why don't we just 2 or 3 of us be in charge of this and 2 or 3 of us be in charge of that, because we all know each other, we trust each other. As soon as you start being civilized, you've got what appears to be government. What you've got is the appearance, the actual functioning of the collective mind of man. There are people, as I was saying, the majority of civilized people, no matter, well, if you can hear me, all civilized people are proponents of government. Or as critics would say, proponents of big government. They're proponents of the government doing as much as they can get them to do. And of course, as always, now we're switching back and forth from metaphor to symbolism to reality and back to metaphor. The government can do anything, but everything it does, it has to take more and more tribute. It has to take more and more in taxation from the people that it's serving. The thing that real tight-ass critics, like they just discovered it, like to holler, hey, the government prints out that money, but they can't make money. The government's not in business. The government does no productive work. They do not manufacture anything. The government has only one source of income, and that's your money. They take the money away from you, and then they go, oh, all right, you be good, and if you deserve it, I'll give you some of it back. And then they go, ha ha, that'll tell them. Okay. I repeat, if you want to see anything worthwhile, if you're not just an ordinary tax-paying citizen, forget all that. That is not the problem to even start with. That's not even worthy of an alert man's attention. What that represents, the reality that is reflecting this to the external world, projecting that to the external world, is the fact that there is a collective mind of man, and each person is living off of its largest, living off of its apparent handouts, and never realizing it. And yet they demand more and more from it, but they don't call it that. They demand it of religion. They demand it of apparently their own mind, if they're really not tight. They demand it of conventional wisdom. And I'm going to end this up because there's no way to prove this. I've just got to point out to you. In the same way that there are demonstrative examples of the government being less efficient in what they do than an individual, such as child care, health care. In the same way that there are undeniable examples of that being so, I'm telling you that every example, once you see it, is undeniable of the fact that anything the collective mind of man thinks is less efficient for a few individuals than anything they could come up with. Now, ergo, whether they be heard that way or not, many examples about such things as one denied. One guy mused that a mystic is just somebody that don't go where everybody else goes. That ain't bad. But not externally. That's of no consequence. It's something else. Because once you see it, to take from the government, that is the collective mind of man, anything that it does for you is less efficient than anything in that same area that you could do for yourself. All right, I'll do it. Did you say anything? No. Anything. Of course, that is absolutely insane, and I would not dance any longer with that club-footed fat person out there in the public arena on that subject. Because then the obvious answer is, or response is, wait a minute, you're saying, if I've been listening to you correctly the last few nights, have you been listening? Are you talking to me? Well, I've been partly aware of what I was saying. Are you saying that anything that normally runs through a man's mind that he calls his thoughts, are you saying that that is the life-generated thoughts? That is the government. I go, yeah. And so you're saying that other than that, whatever it is going through your mind, whatever kind of thoughts you normally have, yeah, you're saying that anything other than those thoughts would be more efficient for the individual's use. And I go, yeah, that's sort of what I'm saying. They go, so you're crazy. Yeah. And they're right. You're absolutely crazy, they would say. Well, sticks and balloons may break my, whatever the cliche is. There's another aspect of plural government. Okay. Repeating again, we're using the government as an external example of the collective mind of man. And may encourage you, if you can do it rather than wait for me to throw it in periodically, go ahead and try to listen to what I'm saying because you've heard it, the setup before. That is, out in the public arena, in the news media. But go ahead and try to simultaneously run you listening to what I'm saying at first a literal and then metaphorical or symbolic level, and then hear it at a metaphorical level simultaneously as regarding your thoughts and not the government. The more unworkable, the more untenable some governmental action out there, some organized collective effort of man, some governmental action proves to be, the more it is inadvertently, silently to most people's minds, the more it is admitting, stating its impotency in the matter. It's a shame there's not a contest about how you can present one sentence in the most complex, oblique manner, or I would have won surely the door prize for the night. The more impotent be men to deal, as they call it, to cure, to deal with some, as they call it, problem. The more impotent they are, the more untenable, the more unworkable, the more useless in actuality is the effort they make, but no one ever sees it. The best they see is what I was using as the first example. The closest they come to, quote, seeing it is the criticism thereof. Would you give us an example? I thought you'd never ask. A great one. Now, I assume everyone knows this is nothing new either, but now we're in the throes of it again. The war on drugs. Anyone with any passing, again, let's just assume that all we know about the war on drugs is what we get out of the press. By any casual perusal of the press, and probably from your own personal experience, the idea of there being a war on drugs is just ludicrous. But the idea that it has shown any signs of success of any person with any understanding, with just any suspicion of understanding, who believes that in some way man can organize himself together, some groups, it won't be all of mankind obviously, that there are large groups or substantial types of people that on this planet can gather together and through their own wherewithal, their own resources, their dedication, using taxpayer money, whatever else it takes, they can wage a successful war and stop people from taking drugs. You know, anyone who believes that there is no, it's a shame to say it, but they're damn close to being less than even of average understanding of life. And yet you know it continues. Every time there's an election, anywhere almost in the world now, someone will say, after the party in power has already, you haven't heard anything from the party in power's war on drugs since the last election. But it will arise again, and a new candidate will say, if elected, I will reinstigate, put back in the vigor and vitality of the war on drugs, by God, because one time we were so close and the present administration just let it slip through their hands. At any rate, and then some critics, as always must be in the external world to keep it going, someone, at least a reporter, will periodically point out, Your Honor, Your President, Mr. Prime Minister, we have spent, according to the government's own figures, we have spent X amount of billions of dollars over the last 3 years of your administration, and by the Drug Enforcement Agency's own minimal estimation, you're only stopping somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.5% of the drugs coming in just through one area of our border. It's easy. Now, if I had more time, maybe I'd drag out a few more cheap laughs to try and get you to see it. It is absolutely ridiculous, in the same way that all attempts at prohibition have always been that arose under conditions wherein free intake of alcohol had been the norm. That once that is established, the idea of prohibiting alcohol, the idea of total success of a war on drugs is based upon the same unrecognized. They certainly don't see it, but here it's based on the same unrecognized attempt, or has the same chance of success of the government being able to pass a law regulating the types of neurotransmitters that people engage in, that the government issue an edict in some way, that they try and judge the amount of a certain drug that gives you a feeling of satisfaction, so a neurotransmitter, and they try in some way to get all the decent, sane, law-abiding people to agree to try and not, in their own brains, to produce any more than, say, the best estimate, but no more than, say, 3 micromilligrams per 24-hour period. It has the same degree of success, that is, none. The only way that you can win the war on drugs or engage in any, or successfully engage in any attempted prohibition of such things, is to kill everybody. At any rate, that's why I said I didn't drag out. You do understand that by any reasonable observation out in the city, not my view, but by their own admission, their own facts, any reasonable person, you would think, when they hear the idea of war on drugs and we need more money, or that's even still going on, that they're still spending out of the taxpayers' money, the person should be somewhere in a state between absolute nausea at this waste of money and a kind of, I guess, faux good-hearted chuckle at the foolishness of government. But are they? Nope. And I was going to use one of the claims to get now more specific to comparing this to the relationship and the reliance of an individual man on the collective mind of man as a comparative example of man in relationship to the government. They will use, even if somebody responds, somebody in a governmental spokesman responds that, yeah, the war is not going as good as we thought, and I know that some figures show that there are more people taking certain drugs now, but here's what we must do. We're going to now. We're trying to pinpoint our efforts to specifically bring down the kingpins in the drug trade, and of course they always point somewhere outside of our borders. We're going to bring down the kingpins of the biggest drug importing organizations, and by so doing, not only when we bring down the kingpins, bring them before the bar of justice, that will dismantle their nefarious organizations and thus discourage other potential upstarts. We covered something similar about terrorists a few weeks back, but consider, and we're not just here to deal in sarcasm, I'm going ahead right quick and do it to lay the groundwork to point toward the head again. Consider, well, I'll ask this rhetorically, it doesn't even need much sarcasm because you know the answer is no, but rhetorically, is there any sane person within the sound of the president's or prime minister's voice, whoever spokesman it is, who says, looks him dead in the camera if he's on video interview time, he says, all right, I know we're having trouble out there on the streets. I know that there's reports that more and more school-aged children are taking drugs. We know all that. So here's what we're going to do. This administration is now devoting all or the major of its drug enforcement in the war on drugs, the majority of its resources will now be focused over in such and such area, such and such country, be focused on the big drug cartels. And what we're going after, even specifically within the cartels, is the head people. Get those kingpins, bring them down, and their organization will fall apart once they're in the custody. And then, by thus doing that, we will discourage the others. We'll stop this thing finally. Does any sane person who listens to that, now of course you're ordinary, right, there's always a lesson again. If you're a sane ordinary person, you would already be listening to that if you had any interest in the fact that we don't need our children taking drugs and it's tearing down society, that you would listen to this, and you're nodding along. Okay. Which that's all was necessary anyway. But, as always, some people are never satisfied. So listen, even though you know the answer, I was going to rhetorically ask, does any sane person, were they to be shook for a second and say, what you're nodding to, that fine speech the Prime Minister just made, you actually believe that? You think that that is true? You think that if they find a kingpin, and they name somebody perhaps, and they estimate that his organization, he and 2 or 3 of his brothers, his immediate family, their safest estimate is that he is making $10 million a day. And as a government, they announce that. And they're usually pretty coy and understated. But they admit that he's probably making $10 million a day. All right, so if they arrest him, after spending 20 years after the son of a bitch, and they finally kidnap him and bring him to the bar of justice back here in our home country, they believe that there are going to be people out there that go, oh crap, I wanted to go in the drug business and maybe make $10 million a day myself. But hey, did you notice after 20 years they caught him and they're going to try him? Right. It is absolutely ridiculous. Again, you people who might be watching this for the first time, this is not a comment at all on the government, on drug enforcement, on drugs, on the futility and insanity of what life drives men to do. I'm trying to get you to consider that the basic, sane, reliable foundations of reality, as sane, ordinary, civilized people call it, cannot even be looked at with anything resembling an objective eye. And yet it doesn't matter. The war on drugs continues. There's no chance of it succeeding. And I hesitate to even say that because I almost want to wash my mouth out for sinking so low to say something so obvious that it's still so far from a real statement of reality. That if you're any good, you can now on your own just simply hear things like the war on drugs. And you don't have to even, much less you don't need me to come along and say something. You don't even have to think about it. There's no analyzation like, well, let's see. It's like hearing, join the church and you'll live after death. There's no question of idiocy or lack of understanding. The proof would be if you want to discuss it with them. Like, could you give me more details? Perhaps I would be agreeable to a tax increase if you can show me where the war on drugs is increasing and inefficient. If you want to talk about it, you're a goner. You are a dyed-in-the-wool, irreversible citizen of the collective mind of man. There is nothing that collective groups of people can do about the so-called collectively perceived problems of man. The civilized, sane, collective consciousness of man at many times, many places, continues to denounce and always has drugs. Things that alter the chemistry of man's brain. That's not what bothers him. Alters his brain, so don't stop. Alters his brain so that it changes his behavior into that which is socially unacceptable, that which is disruptive to the public peace. That's all life is concerned about. That is why we have morals. That is why we have civilizations, institutions. But, having said that, if you followed it, still that which is perceived as being problems, drugs, that which is perceived by the mind of man as being problems, cannot be solved. It's not a theory. It's not my idea. That which is perceived as being something to be solved can't be. And you could say there are varying degrees of how close they can not get to it. And the less close they can get to it, the more vigorous and the more insane will become their claims, such as, all right, the war on drugs has had, we got to admit, it's had its problems. But if we can get to the kingpins of these damn organizations and bring them down, bring them to justice, their whole organization then will crumble, and then finally we'll begin to have a wider effect, because this knowledge will disperse itself. And all other people who are considering going into such an ungodly endeavor, then they'll think about it. It's just absolute insanity. I was also going to speak, I guess, next time on the mistaken wisdom of people who see the error of their ways, which led from this. So, until we meet next time, if you take my advice, don't say anything about seeing the error of your ways until you hear what I have to point out, and then make your own decision. Then see how much of a tolerance you have for chagrin.